Thank you for inviting me here today. So, in an ideal world, it should have been my father, who is a key witness to the state's complicit role and function in orchestrating the genocide, sitting here in this panel today addressing all of you. But sadly, we do not live in an ideal world. We live in a world where systematic, orchestrated genocide goes unpunished for 20 years. We live in a world where justice for the victims of hate and violence is delayed and denied. We live in a world where the perpetrators of these heinous crimes continue to walk scot-free and grow in power, while the very defenders of social justice, of the victims of the Gujarat pogrom, continue to be systematically and vindictively witch-hunted, falsely framed, and incarcerated for having the unrelenting courage to continue fighting for justice for the victims of the Gujarat genocide. 2002 perhaps will be remembered for generations to come as the darkest hour in modern day India. 20 years ago, the targeted massacre of Muslims changed the lives of many. Tens and thousands of innocents who lost their lives, families which were scarred and destroyed, and brave souls who embarked on a long drawn fight for justice for the victims of the state orchestrated hate and violence. It wasn't just the state of Gujarat that burned 20 years ago. What burned along with it were the moral fibers, the secular thread, and the virtue of tolerance we had nurtured for generations. Overnight, the land of Gandhi turned into a laboratory of hate and violence, and we as a society kept watching in deafening silence. 2002 should have been an eye-opener. It should have jolted every breathing individual to their very core, but instead it resulted in everyone closing their eyes tight shut and blindly following a perversive bigot, letting our secular and sovereign nation being seeped into communal hate and divisive politics. The collective fear, apathy, and in some cases greed led to systematic and absolute subversion and saffronization of the very pillars of our democracy. The regime kept up an illusion of a democratic nation, whereas the reality is that democracy in our country has long eroded, leaving behind shells of once robust, honest, and independent institutions. Today, this draconian regime, hiding behind their subservient and subverted institutional bodies, continue to systematically target and incarcerate brave individuals who've had the courage to hold the regime accountable and who pose a threat of unmasking them in the public eye, bringing the political duo to justice for the heinous crimes committed by them in their lust of power. For the past 20 years, brave individuals have been diligently and courageously fighting for a greater cause, some of whom are part of the panel here today, some of whom, like the fearless Mrs. Jaffrey and the likes of her, who continue to seek justice for their loved ones, and some of whom, like my father, Mr. Sanjiv Bhatt, who languishes in jail today, paying the price for having the unwavering resolve and courage to continue fighting this draconian and vindictive regime ever since 2002, till present date, in pursuit of justice for the victims of the Gujarat genocide, all the while bearing the brunt of this fascist regime, fighting with his indomitable spirit, never doubling back, breaking, or bending in his resolve. For the past 20 years, my father has borne the brunt of having had the courage to stand up against this political duo. The easy thing in the face of all of this would have just been to resign from the services or to ask for deputation outside of Gujarat. Abandon the fight for justice, stating this wasn't our fight in the first place. The convenient thing would have been to bend to the whims of this draconian regime and follow other spineless individuals by faking amnesia and downright refusing to truthfully depose before the law in order to appease this fascist government. But did my father choose the easy or the convenient path? No, he did not. Instead, he remained unwavering in his resolve, fighting this often lonely battle. It is easy to flee from the battlefield when the fight gets real and ugly. However, it takes mettle, courage, and diligence of another order to remain standing in the battlefield, bloodied and bruised, fighting a long-drawn, unequal, and lonely battle. For over 2 decades, my father, Mr. Sanjiv Bhatt, has been vindictively victimized by this government for not buckling under political pressure and for daring to speak up the truth. The vindictive victimization of my father started in 2009 when he first started deposing before the SIT, and escalated with his deposition before the Nanavati Mehta Commission and the subsequent submission of his affidavit in 2011 before the Supreme Court of India and before the National Commissions of Minority, implicating Narendra Modi, Amit Shah, and various other state functionaries in the 2002 state-engineered and launched terrorism against the Muslims. His affidavit also contained information about the assassination of Harin Pandya, as well as several extrajudicial killings and fake encounters in the state of Gujarat carried out in the name of protecting the then Chief Minister of Gujarat, the now Prime Minister of India. If it is not already apparent, the Gujarat model is that of intolerance. Either you are with the fascist regime or you are against them. Immediate reward or punishment. While the delinquent officers who aided and abetted this draconian regime in their heinous crimes continued to be rewarded by this regime, honest and diligent officers who stood up against the political duo continued to be vindictively victimized and made examples of. The immediate aftermath of having dared to speak up the truth witnessed my father's suspension and subsequent dismissal under the frivolous grounds of unauthorized absence from duty, an absence which was courtesy his legal obligation to appear and depose before the Nanavati Mehta Commission, a commission established to investigate the state's complicity in the 2002 Gujarat pogrom. My father, Mr. Sanjiv Bhatt, was and is not just being punished by this fascist regime for implicating certain high-level state functionaries in their role in the 2002 Gujarat riots, but also for trying to bring into light the collusion between the SIT and the very state functionaries it was established to investigate. What we witnessed as a family since 2002 was the vindictive victimization and persecution of my father, escalating in 2009, 2011, which took a frightening and dangerous turn in 2018. If suspending him, dismissing him, unlawfully detaining him for having filed an affidavit, withdrawing our security, breaking down our home wasn't enough, the state, at the behest of the political duo, took away my father on 5th of September 2018 under the false pretext of questioning him in a 3-decade-old case with the sole purpose and intent to attempt to silence his voice once and for all. Judicial harassment has been used as an intimidation technique ever since. In an attempt to permanently silence and discredit the only person who can link Narendra Modi to the 2002 Gujarat pogrom, in a gross miscarriage of justice, my father, Mr. Sanjiv Bhatt, was maliciously and falsely framed in a 3-decade-old fabricated case and convicted to life imprisonment by conducting a blatantly vitiated trial by the lower sessions court in India for a crime he did not commit. There cannot be a more blatant example of vindictive persecution of a totally innocent man who did nothing but perform his duty in an outstanding and exemplary manner. My father's truth, integrity, and resolve pose such an undismissible threat to this fascist regime that all the power, force, and fear afforded by the offices held by this political duo and the fascist regime is being exercised to silence and discredit the voice of an honest and upright officer once and for all, to ensure that truth does not see the light of day. In the last 3 years, what we witnessed and what we continue to live is nothing short of a never-ending Kafkaesque nightmare, witnessing a complete desecration of due process, an absolute mockery of the once robust and independent judiciary. For over 3.5 years, we have been running from pillar to post to get one fair day in court. However, we live in a time where one fair day in court is a luxury not afforded to the honest and diligent by this fascist regime. We live in times where perpetrators of genocide, rapists, and killers walk scot-free on bail, while unprecedentedly, our petitions filed 3 years ago keep biting the dust in the registry year after year without seeing the light of day. The intention of this regime is to systematically destroy the credibility of my father so that Modi cannot be held accountable. But what will men with no character know what men like my father are made up of? It is 3 years, 5 months, and 14 days since my father was wrongfully incarcerated by this regime. Our pursuit for justice continues. The problem with this regime is that they think that they are undefeatable and that the defenders are breakable. Well, they are certainly not undefeatable. And one look at the likes of Mrs. Jaffrey, Ms. Setalwar, Mr. Shikumar, my father, Mr. Sanjiv Bhatt, is testimony to the fact that the defenders are certainly not breakable. But while these defenders have continued to hold the fort courageously for the past 2 decades, one cannot help but ponder how, somewhere, we failed as a society when we let these hate-mongering bigots and fascists rise to power, unquestioned and unaccountable. That we failed our country when we decided to remain silent in the wake of the screams of thousands of innocent lives slaughtered to the lust of power. That we failed our defenders when we as a society let examples being made of exemplary men and women who dared to stand up against this regime. That we failed as a society when we could not protect the very brave souls who kept fighting tooth and nail, even when the battle was long drawn and uneven. We failed the defenders when we could not stand up to defend them. Remembering the Gujarat pogrom once a year isn't a luxury we can afford, especially when our country is barely surviving on the tipping point, where the ruling regime will not even bat an eyelid before repeating 2002 to further their political ambition. We live in fragile and dangerous times where holding the regime accountable can get you shackled and thrown in jail, whereas lynching someone in broad daylight can make you an overnight hero of the Saffron Brigade. For the past 20 years, we failed to bring this regime to justice. I'm not saying that the regime was left completely unquestioned. A handful of brave men and women like Mrs. Jaffrey, my father, Mr. Sanjeev Bhatt, Ms. Setalwar, have been and continue to fight against this regime at great personal and professional cost. But when the battle is against the entire machinery, against the deep-rooted, hardwired beliefs of hate and violence, collective peaceful action is the need of the hour to hold the regime accountable. To remind this regime that we haven't forgotten the flames of hate ignited in 2002 in Gujarat, that we haven't forgotten the cries of thousands of innocent lives lost, which continue to haunt the state, that we remember the sacrifices made by diligent and honest individuals, that we remember the sacrifices made by the likes of my father, Mr. Sanjiv Bhatt, and that we stand by them in support of the ones being incarcerated wrongly for having the courage to fight for justice, to remind them that they are not alone in this fight, and to promise them that we as citizens of a secular sovereign nation will not allow any power to be to pit brother against brother and engulf our nation in a fire of communal hate. We mourn today the loss of innocent lives. We mourn today our failure to protect the defenders, our failure to ensure justice for Mrs. Jaffrey and tens and thousands of others who have lost their loved ones to hate and violence, who continue to seek for justice and closure. But most of all, we should mourn our inaction, which has led this country to this dangerous precipice. When we as a society get too comfortable in our apathy, I would implore you to remember the thousands of innocent lives brutally massacred for one man's political ambition, to remember the thousands of victims of crimes against humanity who are scarred for life, living with little to no hope of ever seeing justice in their lifetime, to remember the likes of Justice Loya, Ms. Lankesh, and many more who lost their lives trying to do the right thing while we watched as silent spectators. And remember my father, Mr. Sanjiv Bhatt, and the likes of him, who dedicated and continue to dedicate their life to fight for justice, but we failed to protect them. So when we get too comfortable in our inaction, think about the lives lost, the lives that could have been saved, and the brave lives wasting away. We do not have the luxury, nor can we afford to remember 2002 just once in a year. Rather, it should be living with us day in and day out till justice is delivered, till the perpetrators are held accountable and punished. Question is, will we gather here next year with a heavy heart, mourning the lives lost, or will our heart have some closure of justice having finally been delivered? This has been a long-drawn battle going on for 20 years, escalating dangerously with each passing year. But as my father would say, we will fight, we will resist, we will overcome, and that is certain. Thank you.